Hi everyone, my name is Paul Chalmers and I am the chair of the New Zealand Fabian Society. It gives me great pleasure to be here this evening introducing this topic. We've run 24 of these seminars this year, the Fabians, and this is no doubt, in my mind, the most serious and the most important one that we've put out there. And we're very, very lucky to have two people in the room that have been very closely associated with Kāinga Ora. Obviously, Philippa Howden-Chapman, Professor Philippa Howden-Chapman, who was originally on Housing Corporation, and then under the leadership of Vui Mark Goshi, who is sitting in the audience, was on the Board of Kāinga Ora. I'd also like to note that we are very lucky to have Bernard Hickey here. We're very pleased to have Bernard. Bernard is going to moderate questions and also ask questions of Philippa. I just really thank you very much, Bernard, for coming. I'd like to open it up to Philippa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and it gives me pleasure to talk to you all. Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi ki te kaupapa o tēnei rā. Because I have no conflict of interest now. I was one of the two people on the board who resigned rather than waiting to be kicked off on a point of principle. So I welcome those people who are online too, and I welcome my Kāinga Ora colleagues, and I'll have to stop saying we from now on. So I thought it was such an important organisation with such interesting institutional rules, and I had studied, I'm originally, I teach public policy, and housing has always been one of the areas that I've looked at. And I looked at the original liberal housing in the 1905, and then the first Labour government and all that it built, and followed through, and then was very sad when Bill English said he was the largest slum landlord in New Zealand, and he sold off 10,000 houses. And then we got that period of a shortage of houses, and that's when homelessness first became very apparent in most cities in New Zealand. And I think that's been taken a long while to just start to get on top of, and now we've got the same thing happening again after an extremely badly written report that was a very stiff rejoinder from the Kāinga Ora management, which you can get because it's been released under OIA now, refuting every single point, but it didn't change in the final document. So I wanted to bear witness to what a great organisation it was, and hope that there's a way of, you'll see that this is a different title from what Paul did. It was supposed to be construction and deconstruction, and I'd hope that when we're talking with Bernard, we can talk about reconstruction of public housing. Okay, I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes, and then Bernard's going to moderate. Okay, so I have to turn sideways so I can see this. Okay, so it's a Crown entity, and most of you will know what Crown entities are. They're sort of quite close to the government, where there were two ministers, Minister Wood and Minister Robinson, who sent instructions, and we were required to follow those instructions, and those were ones about equity, that concern about the very low ownership in Māori and Pacific housing, a concern about the fact that a lot of greenfield land was being built on, and there was very poor urban planning. And so there were two roles that Kāinga Ora had, and that's why it was called Homes and Communities. And it was also, importantly, apart from the equity issues, it was supposed to be counter-cyclical. That is, in a recession like now, which is caused actually, as I'm going to propose, because there's no capital going to Kāinga Ora from the middle of next year, so had to absolutely stop all the contracts that they had. And it's Kāinga Ora, it's important to realise, I'm sure that Sorry. Counter-cyclical. So we're in the tipping into another recession at the moment, and I think one of the largest reasons for that is that there's been a complete stop in the large construction industries, and a lot of firms who are private sector. And as I said, I was just saying we weren't the Ministry of Works employing all our own people. It was the private sector and the community housing sectors providers we worked with. And I'm going to talk briefly about equity. I'm going to talk about what they did at sustainability and the innovations, which if you read the Herald, and almost every Herald had, there was a ghastly tenant in the street and a ghastly tenant in the street. When we did a calculation of the number of tenants we have, about 73,000 households, it was 2% of households that had recurrent problems. And of course, these are people who often do have problems, but there were sustaining tenancies, and that's another thing that the government's cut. And as I said, the problem about just saying, there are private community trusts can do this, that isn't true, because they don't have access to capital, and the access to capital is likely to come from the private sector, in which case we could get the thing that happened with old people's homes, where it was originally church groups, they didn't have enough equity, and then the Australian companies came in, and you've got the Ryman's and all those places. Okay, so let's get on the road. Oh dear. No, I think I pressed, okay. So just a brief, this is the brief history. Between 2013 and 2018, the latter part of the previous national government, public housing was replaced with emergency housing, and of course that built up steam during COVID when the moteliers were desperate to have people in their place, and particularly places like Rotorua encouraged that. There was a rapid rise in homelessness, which these pictures are from Wellington. People sleeping on the streets, often curiously just outside where the slot machines were for banks. But I and my group did work for the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development, looking at where there was severe housing deprivation in New Zealand. And these were where there was crowding, substandard housing, no electricity, not all these things in one house, but many of them, no potable water, and this was used to guide where there needed to be new building of state housing. Because we tend to think that there's poor housing in cities, but a lot of rural housing is in terrible condition. Now this I've just taken in the last week because we're starting to get this cycle again. This is someone who's outside one of the hotels, someone just sleeping in a park, and this chap who I've been following just behind the toilets in Oriental Bay, and he's been there for about a month. I never take photos where you can see people's faces, but in fact I saw a woman in labour about a month ago on Lambton Quay. So it's really important to understand the nature of the organisations, and I know some of you will know this very better than I am, and some of you won't, so I thought I'd just go through. So it's a Crown entity. It was established in 2019, and that was when I was in housing New Zealand just for 6 months before that was started. And the main thing was based partly on our work, because we've worked for 25 years showing that housing, if it's got insulation in it, if it's got heating, if it's got ventilation, keeps people in better health. Children do better at school, less hospitalisation, and there's 2 age groups that are particularly vulnerable, older people and children. Now, the next one I want to talk about, explain in detail. One of the major things that was said by the government is this is full of people who don't know how to organise things, don't know how to implement, and they're getting into terrible debt. Well, the assets, of course, we are building houses which belong to the state, and that underpins the reputation of the government and how they can manage. They're estimated at 43 billion, the assets that we had. And we had a debt limit of 15.9 billion. Oh, sorry, a limit of 22, and we got up to 15.9. And that enabled infrastructure of the houses, which I'm going to show you the numbers of soon, but also doing a whole lot of work underground, the infrastructure, which has been neglected for so long in New Zealand. And for a while, 2 years, I think, we had international bonds, the first wellbeing bonds in the world, and that was very carefully, that's how we borrowed from, both internationally and New Zealand. People would go across to Britain. There were more people wanting to buy them than were available, and we very carefully staggered those so that the payment would be paid off as more houses were built. So the idea that somehow we'd been profligate and that there was a big cliff there, financial cliff, was rubbish. The financial cliff was that we were reliant on some capital coming from the government. So from 2019, when I joined, and Vui had been there for 3 years before that, there were 497 public and supported homes built. We also support homes for, built homes for people like Women's Refuge and a whole lot of halfway houses. And so there was a net increase of 3,155. It's a total of, between the various figures, between 72 and 73,000. So as I've said, the capital is stopping at the middle of next year, and they have been told that they are landlords, but they're not to contract any building. And the community housing providers are to take over. That's, there are something like 70 community housing providers. Only 5 of them have actually any experience in building, particularly people like Salvation Army, who can, part of a religious group that have capital coming from that too. They can take over, but they lack scale, and the issue is that they could be swallowed up as private investors want equity out of them. And then I'm going to just talk about that briefly. Kāinga Ora, there are advantages with organisations. They have legislation, they have institutional rules that are written up. And it has a public good focus. That is, profit's not supposed to be made out of it. It creates public control, and as one of the bankers in the board used to say, the state has patient capital. And we heard that quite a number of times. It's not like you have to do things quickly and cut corners, because you're going to own the homes, hopefully, for 60, 90 years. They're built to last, these homes. Now, the community housing providers, there are 38 of them. They're not publicly owned. They're the trusts, and they're not subject to government rules about public benefits, except when they're registered as charities, and not all of them are registered as charities. They do not have the same requirements to take people from the public housing waiting list, which is organised by Ministry of Social Development. That's the one where you get income-related rents. That is, if a landlord gets income-related rents, it means the person in the house pays no more than 25% of their household income. So it puts people in a good position. And assets can be managed as private businesses and incorporate private equity. There's a big discussion going on now saying, oh gosh, I've got to speed up, saying, oh, well, what does it matter if it's a private landlord or if it's a public landlord or it's a charitable landlord? It does make a big difference. And interestingly, Kāinga Ora, like the government, has AAA rating from Standard & Poor's, and I copied this out from the bottom. I might take this out and then I can look back. Oh, no, I won't. That it says critical role, given that this is Kāinga Ora, is mandated and operated on behalf of the Crown to provide a key public service. i.e. the provision of social housing to the most vulnerable segments of the New Zealand population. I thought that was fairly eloquent from Standards & Poor's. So we're now about to lose that organisation. Oh, God. Oh, is it? Now, this comes from the IDI. This is the Integrated Data Infrastructure. Some of you will know every time you go to the doctor, you're contacted by the police, anytime you have contact with the government, it's recorded in Statistics New Zealand. And we're one of the groups that have, I have a group of about 30 people. We have 6 people working on the Integrated Data Infrastructure. And this is one up from IO. And this is looking at, it's actually quite tricky to work out who's in community houses and who's in Kāinga Ora. But this is the general gist of it. It goes from 2019 to 2023. So this is when Kāinga Ora was started. And you can see that there's been a steady rise with 26,000 more tenants in public and community housing. And the number IRRS, the income-related rents at the bottom, that shows you the number of dwellings. So that's a net number of dwellings. So you can see that there's a real increase. Now, I thought I'd show you some pictures. I know some of you, there's a lot. It started with most of the building being done in Auckland, but one of the things is it's been very through regions, and we've done lots of the Kāinga Ora board went down to lots of different parts of New Zealand to look how it was going. This is one, this is the Studio Architects, this is in Britomart, this is down in Wellington, and this is one, Puni Housing, this is in Lower Hutt. And in this one, there's the local Māori community have a very good organisation for assisting people. They've taken on making sure that the tenancies are sustained, so someone who gets into debt or if there's issues that need discussing, they're working on that. Now, when I talked about this large-scale development, there are 9 of them, and I'm not quite sure what stages they're all at, but you might be more up with it than me. This is one in Eastern Pororoa. The previous government, as I mentioned, Minister English at that stage then, set up 2 of these because he couldn't get people to just buy the houses. So he set up 2 companies, one in Eastern Pororoa, which is the one that's close to where I live, and there's 9 of them. They're right around the country. Mangere is another big area. I'm just going to point over here. The pipes there that you can see, the very large pipes, are there because this whole area, which was built when the Queen was coming to look at the state houses in 1950, didn't have any sewage pipes, and 98 million litres of raw sewage went into Pororoa Harbour every year, and you see communities getting shellfish and so forth like that. 98 million litres. And of course, this is an area where it was predominantly state housing. Now some of it, and quite a lot of it, sold off. These pipes are absolutely huge. They're about that high there. And this is Bottomley Park that they're doing. There's a phenomenal amount of work going on there. So remember, it's state houses and community regeneration. This is one I hope Vui might be here. There's a distinguished presence just here. And this was in Tauranga, where you know is one of the fastest growing areas in New Zealand. Now this is a really difficult land, and this is one time when we were doing greenfield site. It's still in abeyance, I think. It's not clear whether it's going to go ahead. A huge amount of work done on this for about 3 years, working very closely with the iwi and so forth. And this is the kaumātua here talking about the history of the place. So as well as building houses, there's also those huge big works going on there. Now Tauranga land, most of you know, it's fingers like this. It goes down into the harbour, and basically it's sand, ash, sand, ash, sand, ash, and the piles have to go down at least 9 metres. So you've got really, really complicated topologies and building. Those of you who are builders know how difficult that is. Now, the next thing I want to get on to is sustainability. So, I mean, this is a government organisation or Crown entity that represents us all. And one of the things that the government has to do is to reduce carbon emissions. Now, this comes from actually Australian group, and you'll see that. Sorry, this doesn't have a pointer on it, does it? No. You can see it's at the top there, the dark blue is the built environment. So their best estimate is that if you build houses properly and the Kāinga Ora houses are built above code, that's saving 20% of potential carbon emissions embodied in it and also going forward. And the other part is transport. And I was one of the people on the board who kept on saying, well, when we choose our location, how far is it from public transport? Are there cycleways, walkways? Is it going to... Of course, there was huge amount of discussion about the light rail and so forth. And so all those things are quite complicated and huge amount of expertise brought into that. Now, we also went round because one of the areas where we're doing large-scale works was in Napier, and I mean, that was an eye-opener for, no, Auckland was bad. But here, I'm just going to walk away from this a minute. You'll see here, this is all of us here, the board here, and here you can see there was a four-lane concrete bridge going across, and the flooding came right up past here and just flipped those things down there. Oh, where is it? Which one? I was
Red one.
The red one. Okay. Okay, so thank you. So you can see there's part of the bridge that went further down. Huge damage there. And that's another thing that Kāinga Ora went in to help rebuild houses, and there's still a phenomenal amount to do there. And of course it's largely Māori communities there, not all with insurance. So that's who is going to be doing that. Of course, Māori communities themselves are very resilient and stuff, but the organisation to get all these things done is amazing. And I think one of the institutions that's going to have most impact on what we do, and it'll be interesting to see how the current government deals with this, is our growing climate change costs in New Zealand. Now here you can see this is 2003, this end here, going forward to 2023. So changing weather potentials have the potential are very costly. And this comes from actually the Infrastructure Commission. So if the government continues to ignore, and this keeps on going up and up and up and up, we will have lots of things that require a good deal of capital. Okay, this is just reiterating the point. We've written a book on improving buildings, cutting carbon, and the board was generally agreed that we were required to do it, and in fact there's still a discussion about if the Kāinga Ora doesn't do it, that's a first on the government's books. And so we were supposed to meet the goal, but we weren't necessarily funded to do this, so there was all sorts of trade-offs between different co-benefits, because one of the other things that we were doing was that this is the emissions reduction plan, which we managed to get hold of under the Official Information Act. It was actually supposed to be published this year but wasn't, and this has a clear emissions target. For example, transport, got to move to public transport, careful location, strengthen public transport. Those were all things that Kāinga Ora was doing. And it's worth having a look at. And this is how many, almost 1 million tonnes of we've got to get reduced by 2030, and that's a lot, and the trees aren't going to do it all for us. And then we have to buy very, very expensive offsets from overseas. Now, this comes from just where I work, and this is an example of how they were onto this a bit in the 60s. This was one of the council houses here, somebody walking from there, right, connected to the buses, and this one says it's actually going to the railway. So these are really important, and so it's linking and creating communities. This is the last detailed slide. There was a large organisation has scale, and it can do things in a very innovative way. It employed a really, really talented pool of architects and engineers and managers. And one thing that I don't think people didn't realise is that because we were owning the houses, or that was the aim, the government agreed to setting up consentium, so we could consent our own houses. And I was a bit kind of, is this a good idea? But because we're actually owning them, it saves all the delays in the councils and so forth. And the councils were quite pleased that we relieved the pressure from them. We developed a housing delivery system, and people can ask me about this afterwards. It's very, very interesting. It basically gets everybody at the beginning of the week, architects, engineers, builders, anyone who's involved in development. There's usually 30 houses done at once. There's one in Auckland, there's one in Christchurch, and I think there's one in Rotorua. And they cut the time from design to consent from 17 months to 6 weeks, and building time was cut in half. Now, this is, you read that, they don't know how to build, they don't know how to get money, that is completely untrue. And I've already talked about that we build above the building code, because we have one of the lowest building codes in the OECD, and we have an unusual climate because we have both heat and cold and also very heavy rain. And we are the only agency, and this was done willingly because many people on the board and new people with disability who actually have targets for accessible build housing, about 21%. So we don't have those kind of ramps that means someone who's using a stick or has a disability can't get there. And we also recognised, and we had a large role in this too, that a lot of people wanted to live in multi-generational housing. So there was, particularly in Mangere and Porirua and areas, it's a very more common in Chinese communities, Māori and Pacific communities. And of course locations close to transit corridors. Now, the other thing that people don't recognise is that actually we're doing very interesting experiments. This is Jennifer, one of the engineers. They did with money from MB, this is a solar array in Christchurch, and there's another one in Auckland, isn't there? I think, yeah. And these are sort of smart grids. In some cases they're individual, but they are working so that they could collect solar and distribute to other people in the community, which is what we have to do. It's the transpower and just bringing everything from the south to the north is really, really inefficient and not resilient. But all the money for that is stopped. So this is the beta development in Mangere, which is another of the large-scale ones, which Vui, I think, is here. And this is Vui here again. And this is Patrick Doherty, who's the asset manager. And this is the first passive housing, public housing in Australasia. Very, very, very interesting. So that's another innovation that we did. And I'm going to go through this very quickly, just so that you know about it. We got money from you, the taxpayers. This was when wearing my other hat as a professor looking at public housing. And the question was, I had seen this, Labour bills, national sells the house, Labour bills, national bills. It's like a seesaw. And so I thought, well, the only way we can try and bake that rather naively, I think, was evident. I thought if we provided the evidence that it was useful, they might listen. But that was very naive. So so that this is one of the largest grants that's been given. We collaborate with 8 different organisations, community housing, as well as Kāinga Ora, and we're comparing their approaches to urban regeneration. We look at the quality of the housing. Do they have boards and governance group? Where do they get their money from? Are the people warm in their housing? What do they think about communities and so forth? And we look particularly interested in placemaking, and this is Tamara, which was built by the Wellington City Council and is now owned by Kāinga Ora. Kāinga Ora often went in, and it goes in if private developers go bankrupt, which they're doing quite a lot, and we were still underwriting Kiwi build houses, which was more successful than it was given out to be. And this is a poll from, because this is on Taranaki streets, and the Taranaki tribes were marched down on their way to the hulks and thrown rotten fruit at them and so forth, and after the wars. And so this is a memorial to remember what has happened there. Okay, this is Wainuamata. This is where we're doing work with Papa Kāinga Housing, and I've been working with this community for about 25 years now. And we're going to put solar panels on, and that's going to have Papa Kāinga Housing out the back here. That's a log story. You can ask me a question about that. But okay, so the second to last slide is we work with Arthur Grimes at Motu, the Deputy Governor as well as of the Reserve Bank. And we were thought that the wellbeing budget and the wellbeing framework was really important. Our health and wellbeing is what we all want. So we did questions that are used internationally, and we know that housing, especially if they're damp and cold, people feel miserable. And we're wanting to know whether what is the difference between people who are in public community housing, which we're wrapping all together at this stage, as against private rental and owner-occupiers. Now, this was really interesting. We got this out before the last election, hoping that people might vote on the basis of this, but I'm not sure. There was a survey of people in public rentals, private rentals and homeowners, and public tenants have higher subjective wellbeing than do private tenants. Now, we think that's largely because they're in better quality housing, and also it was security of tenure. You weren't, the 90-day rule had gone at that stage, and so as long as you paid your rents and you were a good member of the community, you could stay, and that's incredibly important for children in school and so forth. And we think, and the other interesting thing was that the subjective well-being was similar to well-being in owner-occupiers. So we think that that's the, this is conjecture here, but we think it's the security that is actually a critical issue. And the length of tenure, I've just said that. Now this is one I put as, this is the really second to last one. This is Te O, who's in Rolleston, and there was 300 apartments in this dwellings. I had actually, at the very beginning, I'd turned the sod at this building. It took 6 years to go from the land. It's really fun turning the first sod. And actually, at the last minute, I was asked to do the speech to open it. And it was dawn. And so I'm hoping that there's a new dawn coming. And then the very last one, Bernard said he used to live near here. This is a very large development. It was going to have, it's Arlington. It was going to have cross-laminated timber, which was one other of the innovations that Kāinga Ora was working with. And here you have Morris Clark, who was McKee Fell, who was doing it. And this is when Megan Woods was launching it. This is just after COVID, because they had police, they were under protection actually, and Grant Robinson was there too. And then it went on really fine.
It's actually me on the far right of that picture.
Is that you? Oh, did you go along to that launch too? Oh, I see, catch it in history. I didn't know there was another famous person there. And then this continued. I walk this way to work every day. It worked. It went very well for a while, and then no capital, so they had to stop it. And so it's been like this now for over a year, I think, because it was where the government before said, you know, don't you dare anticipate the budget. And then this is, comes from the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors in March this year. And this is construction activity by country, and I can't read those either, but except the one that's going down. Australia's about here, I think it's doing okay, but this is us. So our construction sector all over the country has just stopped, or not stopped, quite a lot of them. And of course, remember all the subcontracts and the sub. So it's the opposite of the multiplier effect. It's just disaster. So Kāinga Ora was, sorry, that was a long 20 minutes, Bernard. Kāinga Ora was an exceptional developer of large-scale land and public housing, a really, really committed group of people, committed to sustaining tenants for low-income tenants. And deconstructing, I used that word because the government, without reading the documents or engaging in any discussion, decide to get rid of it. It's got to redo it, somehow kind of emerge as another kind of organisation, who knows what. I'm not privy to it at all anymore. It got rid of an effective, innovative, large-scale organisation on ideological grounds, and I do think that's wasteful and very, very damaging. And the impact on the construction and associated sectors has deepened the economic recession. So I think they have, that's why I was really keen to talk sooner than later, because I think this is so preventable. I mean, cut it back if you want to, sort of tweak it a bit here and there, but don't get rid of the whole thing. And this comes from, our daughter lives in New York, and this is all through the subways in New York. They have these little figures. You can see here they're often bankers, actually, here, little figure here, and another one there, and they're soaring off this old rusty pile of the subway. So I thought that was a good analogue of what the current government is doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you, Philip. And be prepared to be cross-examined by Bernard.
Maybe I'll cross-examine.
Yeah, you could. Bernard, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Philip. Do you want to grab that microphone so we can...
Keep them close.
I'll assume this is on. Can people hear me okay? Fantastic. Thank you very much, Philip, for that setting of the scene for what was a success story, which has now been dismantled. Could you, firstly, though, give us a sense of, right from the start, why do we need the state involved providing social housing? Because for 20 or 30 years we were told that, you know, the private sector can provide these houses, and everyone wants to be an owner of their own home, and this is getting in the way. So why do we need the state involved?
Well, actually, that was one of the, before I answer your question, that was one of the other things I got rid of. Had first home buyer loans, which were a real build-up of Māori and Pacific doing those, and there were quite a lot who had been approved, and so there was a lot of discussion, can these go forward? So it's not, Kāinga Ora actually did quite a lot of helping people into first homes and so forth. But I think for the years of the previous government, there was very, very little public housing building. That's why I showed quite a number of pictures of homeless people, because private developers, quite rife, you know, their institutional rules are making money, otherwise they can go broke. Or you know, they're employing people, and they got to make a profit. And there's a social welfare on having, in fact, there's human rights. We've signed up to all sorts of UN agreements that there is a right to housing. And I don't think you can ask some, you know, I know there are some who are very socially minded, but you can't ask private builders, not to make less of a profit, so that everybody can have a home. I think we need a mixture of, obviously, the Mark Todds and people who do innovative stuff, but you also need the state who can take risks about trying new kind of technologies, who build above the code and have got that patient capital. Because of course, if you've got assets of 48 billion, that means that gives you eventually, there'll be a balance in it. As there's more houses, you can build in a way that you don't have to borrow so much even from the government.
So what went right in the process of trying to increase the supply? You've got 8,500 new homes, a good chunk of which are actually replacing ones that are...
No, that was net. So
3,500 net, 8,500 total.
Yeah.
So what did you get right? What did Kāinga Ora get right? I'm particularly interested in the more efficient building system that was built.
Oh yeah, the housing condition. So it was a delivery system, yeah. Well, in the board meetings, so it started off with anecdotes. They'd say, look, first of all, we realised that there's a lot of slackness amongst building and infrastructure and buildings, and particularly in there would be, because we've made sure that there's no serious injuries over all that building. WorkSafe was very clear, but there'd be things like somebody is supposed to have had the electrical lines around the outside, and they'd be diagonally across the house, and we'd say, any strikes this week, so the infrastructure is very so, and then when you they'd say, well, we were trying to start on this these series of neighbourhoods, and we asked for 3 electricians to come along to do stuff, and one turned up, and he didn't have all the equipment, and then they had to go back. And it's those of you who've had building and stuff will be aware that there's delays. Well, first of all, there's the delays in getting the consents and stuff, which we were able to do very quickly. But then there's the kind of, well, that's useless if everybody's hanging around smoking or doing whatever they're doing, waiting for the other 2 electricians to come. So this was, I was sceptical at first, as very well know, because I thought it was a bit like Taylorism, like a factory where everyone had to go to. But extremely exciting. It's a room about like this. The gong goes, and mainly young people there. And the architects provided coffee machines. But everybody was there, and they went through the 30, the houses, and saying, okay, the drainage need to be done this week, and then is it done? And then someone would say, well, actually, no, somebody was sick, and we couldn't, that couldn't work. So who is going to do it? So it's right on the spot, and it was for them. It was really, really exciting. So the idea that they were very inefficient, I've seen it. I've seen it in 2 or 3 of the centres, and it was amazing. People have come to look at the system from America and also from Australia. It's sort of, in terms of productivity, it's exceptional.
So criticism of Kāinga Ora was that the cost of building per square metre was, some argued, higher than for other building producers. So what?
That is disputed.
Yep.
Yeah, that's you've got. Once it was seen that people were going to skeleton, people were. There was the view that community housing could build cheaper, but that has not been proven, and you can see 2 lots like that. And I would say that we built to a higher standard. We were taking care of carbon emissions. There are some very good community housing providers like Otatahi, Salvation Army is the one that the government goes to, because of course there are religious linkages, and don't have the capital, the council trust, to actually do it. So it's...
And how much of the cost that Kāinga Ora was taking on was not actually the cost of building the actual house or apartment. It was all of the groundwork and the pipes and the sewage and all the connections to the networks, which typically would have been provided by a water care company or a networking company?
Well, we worked with those people. I mean, so it's not that we were trying to develop the expertise inside. Many of you probably know about Alliance. It's how the Waterview Bridge tunnel was built. It's where you get a group of people who say, okay, we'll do it together, we'll try and reduce the amount of wastage and time, and everybody agrees and they come together for that particular project. So those big ones, those are the large regeneration projects. They weren't all like that. But I think somebody I know who did a big study about public housing, New Zealand housing, as a geologist, and she said basically, before these reforms, Housing New Zealand housing was built on contaminated land, for example, and they didn't bother to, and the same is true as we know in private housing too, when all that asbestos was just dumped out in the southern motorway, people kind of don't worry about what's underneath the ground, but actually it's very important. So I think they chose middle-level companies, not the really top ones, but people who were still, number two tries harder. And those alliances have been extremely successful.
So Kāinga Ora has been able to ramp up house building to thousands of houses per year by the end of the 5-year period. There was real momentum getting built. There were a lot of these projects where there'd been a lot of work done with the local communities. People were coming on board. Why then, when there was a change of government, was there so little public support for what was going on? The government was able to simply make a broad accusation that it had failed, it was financially unsustainable, and there was barely a murmur from within civil society, you could say, about what had gone on.
Well, that's partly why I'm bearing witness to the story now. I'm also a social scientist, apart from other things, and I collected all the clippings from the Herald and the Dom Post. I mean, the Otago Daily Times is about the only sort of vaguely left-wing paper, and they were full before the election of, well, I have this terrible tenant alongside, and I phoned up Kāinga Ora and they didn't do anything. We had a sustainable framework. I mean, they're not miracle workers, but employ huge amount of social workers and work with the communities. So that is really interesting, actually, when you look at the quality of the design of the housings around. I was just taking Rafe around Mangere looking at the houses there. There's a quality difference. You can, I know the design of Kāinga Ora houses, but there's a quality difference in the gardening, the landscaping, the being near parks and so forth than the private ones. I don't know. In fact, we're signs on it. The managers were telling me, people would come say, oh, these are we really like this, how much are they going to be? So they're a premier. I don't think it's the houses they don't like. It's the them and us in terms of the community.
What's that about? Because you see this a lot, as you say, the reporting from Northland and various other places where there's this visceral, don't build it near me because my property values will go down.
And Arthur Grimes has, there's been a thesis done in Christchurch, and we're just replicating it more widely. If you actually, your housing is round Kāinga Ora houses, your property values actually go up.
What? I didn't.
Well, it's like, it was really visceral. I think the government, the incoming government decided, well, they'll make a big song and dance about Kāinga Ora, but gosh, And it wasn't, it was sad to me that there were some letters saying, this is unfair. And of course, private tenants can't kick up a fuss and say there's mushrooms growing in my living room because the roof's leaking, because they know that they'll have to leave. So, and people, sometimes it was Kāinga Ora tenants, and they're it gets a bit. Sometimes things aren't done as quickly because there's a desire to actually intensify the land. So it's no use putting a huge amount of money into a house if it's now it's going to be shifted off somewhere else. And in terms of deconstruction, because one of the ways of reducing carbon was not to just put a bulldozer through it, but we went to where is it, the part where we went where the stuff is deconstructed and sent to Tonga, isn't it, in containers, and the community was really pleased about that, because usually when the bulldozer and everything it's very noisy, and it provided labour for people doing it, and all the timber, which is often native timber and stuff, was shipped off to build houses in Tonga. So none of those things ever got into the media.
But was there a failure in a way to get a social licence for this by Kāinga Ora to be able to win over the local editors of the local newspapers to say this is actually a good thing and it's not just a threat?
Well, I can tell you we had very good comms people and they tried their very best. So I think it is a real issue of what has occurred in New Zealand society, that it's so difficult to get that message across. Because I think it is. And we, the board was very aware of social licence. It was a phrase that came up a lot. We can't lose our social licence. And I mean, these communities, there was not only just really nice housing there, but there were amenities like there's a barbecue place that the local community can come into too. I can't actually answer that question. I'm still somewhat bewildered by it. I know I'm rose-coloured spectacles, but
I wondered if we now know that when people are in insecure, unhealthy housing, and we know that private rentals are often insecure and unhealthy, that means people have to go to hospital more often. They're less likely to learn. They're more likely to bounce through numbers of schools.
Yeah.
The kids are growing up in stressed situations. They're not as healthy. They might need to get food from school. Hopefully there's a lunch program there when they get there. And as the families and people grow up, go out into the workforce, they're less likely to be productive, and they're more likely to cost, if you like, the state more. They're turning up at A&E with chest infections.
Yeah, we've done a lot of work on that.
Yeah. There's some research on this.
Yeah.
Yes,
a
which
lot.
you've done. So if I was a really, economically driven arguer, you could easily go to the government and say, actually investing in public housing is going to save the state and taxpayers a lot of money, and here's how much over the years.
You don't think we've done?
Well, I didn't see it in the New Zealand Herald.
Oh, well. Actually, I'd have to say this is a really important role of Fabian society, because I'm sure many of you knew the things I'm saying, but there will be things in that you haven't heard, because it has been very, very difficult to get that story across.
Because I know the story that has been put out and was successful in getting the Healthy Homes, the Warmer Homes initiative going. And this is something actually I'd hear back from National Party politicians, partly because, they've been involved over the years in...
I meant to talk about that.
Yes, so this is where effectively the government subsidised the insulation of homes and the putting in of heat pumps, because research that Philippa and others have done showed that the benefit to cost ratio to the state, if you like, was, from memory, 12 to 1 or something.
Yeah, it's huge. And in fact, Neville Pearce, who's a co-director with me, won the Prime Minister's Science Prize for that. And it's like, the thing is, public housing, that was one of the things that the government said, you've got to do it, and you've got to do it by July this year. And so 100% of Kāinga Ora houses are brought up to that standard. Now, it's supposed to apply to private rental housing too, but no a record of where the private rental houses are. And occasionally MB, the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, will phone up Neville and say, what are the areas where there's high amounts of rental housing? So he'll tell them what the kind of neighbourhoods are, and they go in and look a few there. So that's the thing, that the state, if it's working well and it has the right values, can do things very, very well. And the CHIPS did it too. And like Otatahi, I think, was the first one to get all these done. And so we had groups of tradesmen going around the country, all around the country fixing up the homes.
So that's the number I'd love to see, is for every state house that's built, maybe it does cost $600,000.
Yeah.
How much does that house save and generate in not just tax revenues, because people who are working from that house will be paying income tax, maybe not paying capital gains tax, but they're healthier, they're in happier situations. As your research showed, people have better well-being, or at least as good well-being if they're in a secure state house than if they own their own home. That is going to generate value and cost savings for the state and for the taxpayer. And if you wanted a really sort of brutal monetary argument, you'd say to the people of Whangarei or Rotorua, hey, for every state house that we're building, we're saving you, the taxpayer, over 50 years. It costs $600,000. Actually, the benefit to the taxpayer is 73 million or whatever the number is over 50 years. I wonder if that work had been done, do you think that could have changed that?
That work has been done. It's just very hard to. I'm lucky enough to be in love with an economist who is very familiar with all this stuff too. And they had a very good economic team.
Can I be rude and say, why didn't Labor use those numbers to argue for Kāinga Ora?
Well, I don't think anybody expected quite the demolition job that was done, and it's very looking at the sort of discount. We were talking before about discount rates, and so normally people just think about what the costs are now. It's quite hard to explain to people who haven't particularly thought about it. Well, actually, if you spend a bit more money now, so I'm making sure that it reduces the carbon in the house and that it's warmer and you don't have to do any maintenance on it for 15 years, that's going to save you money. People don't really get that. It needs someone really explaining that carefully. Oh, good on you.
Now the question is, so what happens in the next 3 years? What are we likely to see? Now that the building's been dead stopped, and you're right, it has completely frozen and wrecked the momentum in the construction sector in a much wider way. So it's not just building Kāinga Ora homes. The subcontractors who were working on that are now no longer working. They've jumped on a A320 to Australia. And just as we saw in 2008-9, when there was an exodus of tradespeople during that cessation of work, some might come back, most won't, and you have to train a whole new cadre, or more importantly, actually just import people to do it. So I'm wondering what more demolishment could happen that we need to watch out for.
Well, I mean, I don't know what they've got in mind. I know that one of the people who was group with Sibyl English is on the board, and I mean, I'm not privy to anything there, and so I have no information about what's going to do. But the implications are that they wanted to that Kāinga Ora can be a landlord of the building that it's got, but they but houses that they don't want it to do any more building, and they want it all done by the.
So
pardon?
That's happening now. So, by Chris Bishop and the government is right. You know, we were building 3,000 houses a year with Kāinga Ora. I've offered 1,500 income-related rent subsidies to the community housing sector, and they can do the building and the management, and then the capital of the state doesn't have to get spent. I can keep the deficit low and keep debt low, and therefore keep interest rates low, and that's the main aim in life. So can the community housing providers use those 1,500 income-related rent subsidies to actually go out there and borrow the money and build the houses?
I mean, that was the point I had to. I realised I'm going a bit over time. That was my slide when I was looking at comparison of what might to Kāinga Ora, which I said it came from bonds and originally, and then from the state. The interesting story about why the bonds stopped. is that it was slightly more than the government had to pay for debt. Sort of, what was it, 0.2?
60 basis points.
So
Yeah,
very,
like
very small about, but Treasury didn't like that. So Treasury had said, okay, you can borrow from us and it'll be the same and capital will always be open to you and all that kind of thing. And of course that was the end of that. So do in, say, America or Canada or countries, it's a sensible way of doing it so that it's like putting, people, there's the large sovereign wealth grants and money in ACC and superannuation, people could invest knowing that that wasn't going to be spent on roads, but it was going to be invested in housing. So I think going forward, that argument's got to be made better, I think.
The irony is that with growing wealth inequality and more of the money flowing to fewer people at the top, they're actually desperate to find safe places to put their cash. And the first place they look is a government bond. And the last big new syndication of bonds just a few weeks ago, for every $1 billion that was being borrowed by the government in bond issues, there was $22 billion worth of bids from fund managers.
That was the same with the wellbeing bonds. In fact, it was extraordinary. So there's something very screwy there that we need to kind of get in balance.
This argument that there's no money left, that the government's in theory, going bankrupt, is simply wrong. And if it was, then the rest of the world, let alone the pension funds here, wouldn't be lending money to New Zealand. So just sort of to wrap it up, because
we should give these people have questions.
Yes, questions. Just one final one from me. What would you do differently if you had a chance, or what do you think the board could have done differently if you'd had a chance to try and prevent this?
Well, it's a bit tricky. I've answered that. I mean, it's like I was only free to speak after I resigned. And because you can't have people, what happened to some people who spoke when they were still on boards, that's the end of them. Although they've got very sensible ideas. So, I mean, that's important. You can't have, which is happening a lot now, people having 2-3 hats and shifting depending what they say. So it's not like I'm connected to bankers and all the kind of things all the deals that are being made in the government at the moment. It's hard to say. I don't know. Boy, maybe you would like to contribute.
Just before we, you might has become very remote, and it's not working. So you forward it through Bernard, and he can repeat it to the audience.
Yeah.
So up the back.
Okay. How critical was it, the shift under the key government for again taking Kāinga Ora away from being a tenancy manager and putting that role with the Ministry of Social Development? Did that kind of divorce?
So the question was, how important was the change under the key English government when Paula Bennett was there to moving the tenancy management role from Kāinga Ora to MSD?
Actually, I think that's a really good question. And one of the reasons you'll see I'm still talking about public housing, because the National, and particularly Sir Bill English, talks about social housing. And that's because he includes income-related rents, accommodation supplement, a whole variety of things that have any linkages, emergency housing benefits. And there was the idea, well, this would be easier if it was run through MSD. In fact, MSD's in real problems at the moment. It's got very poor IT and it's not connected, and it's, that's another area where there's not been enough infrastructure development. But I think separating it out has been really tricky. For one thing, people think we can build as many houses, Kāinga Ora can build as many houses as it's got capital for. But in fact, they can't build public housing unless they get an income-related rent subsidy. And that all goes through MSD and Treasury, Government Treasury, MSD.
And we still don't actually have the details of what that 1,500 income-related rent subsidies actually is, and whether it's enough to convince the banks to give money to them.
Treasury did some work.
Discussion of the kind of selling it. Did that shift kind of mean that then the whole idea was that Kāinga Ora public housing was kind of, you know, you had to be really, really needy just to justify it as kind of a moral thing being added
Yeah.
to the frame?
Yeah, there's a lot of moral stuff in it. Yeah.
So, next question. Yes.
Fundamentally, this government is a libertarian government. That is, it believes that goods and services are best provided through the market. In the past, Labor has tended to try and sort of move a bit towards the market and regulate it. But it seems to me that if you're really going to make a social contract, there needs to be a clear definition of the inadequacies of a market-led answer to the kind of state-provided stuff. Lay clearly out the advantages of that, and then you get your social contract.
So what's the question I should ask? So the question, it sounds like, how do we, how do you explain the need for social housing, for state housing?
How are you asking me? Well, for one thing, we know that there's big discrimination in the. So if you turn up with a tattoo, if you've got more melanin in your skin, and if you've got a child, you're less likely to actually be able to rent a property. And now they've got rid of sustaining tenancy, so you can be, as our daughter has been in New York twice, we need the house now, can you go? And you've got a young child, and that's really, really tricky. So, I mean, that stability is absolutely critical, I think.
Yes. Peter. Yeah. Hand up, and I pointed, and then I saw who it was.
Question actually really in a way for both of you, I may. You mentioned the media, you mentioned New Zealand Herald. It seems to me that every story I ever read in the Herald about Kāinga Ora was a negative one, whether it was about the kind of developments too good for poor people, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a big thing. Or do we really want to make it above the code? Isn't that good enough for everyone else?
Bike tracks and raised pedestrian crossings. But what do you think of it? What could you do to improve the standard of media reporting, education and media attention about this? Bernard and I are doing our best, actually. But what do you what's the gap there, and also what's the motive? There's a motive behind some of this. And also, my second question, if I may, what's the motive, or what's the difficulty in New Zealand of getting bipartisan agreement on things with something so enormous as a social contract?
Yeah, it's really interesting. When I've got some, pardon? Oh, sorry. What I was supposed to think of that. Sorry. Was that has the thing, and how can you change the story, and how can you get bipartisan agreement? Some of the young people in my group, I've got them looking at what public housing is like around the world, and actually, I think the Prime Minister's going to Europe. So somewhere is it him recently? Going to Austria, and Austria is really interesting because it's got a huge amount of public housing. It was built in the and it's continued, and middle class people live there. So it's kind of, and same in Netherlands, partly because of course both were bombed, and it seemed perfectly okay to live in community housing, just like we go to lots of community or stuff. But that's really changed, and it's like, and as there's a shortage, it's people who are more and more in need in them. Whereas quite a lot of people working in Kāinga Ora, they grew up in them. Their fathers came back from the war, and people were lawyers or builders and everything. They could be in Kāinga Ora homes. So there's partly a class thing going on, I think.
Can I just, I've got a couple of reasons why I think this is the case. Firstly, there was a bipartisan approach on social housing broadly from the 30s to the 90s, in part because you're right, people had grown up in them, they'd seen the problem, it had been a success. There were times when Labor built and National sold them, But part of the reason National sold them is that they were good houses and there was a whole bunch of people who wanted to own them for themselves, so they'd buy them back. But never at a scale that actually removed social housing. The thing I think really has changed the environment for the reporting and the way that the stories are told in public is, firstly, since about the early 2000s, the explosion in house values, and particularly in land values, has created an entire new class of very wealthy people in New Zealand who happen to own their own home. And they have quickly understood that the way to get ahead is to have leveraged equity in their own residential land, and if possible, many plots of residential land, and that any changes, even at the margins, the value of that residential land is a clear and present threat to their own families' financial futures. And so when even the idea that someone's going to come along and live next to the plot of land that's suddenly valuable might reduce the value of that plot of land, that is like a dagger to the heart of how you think the world works and should work. And it's because in 1989, the proposal by the then Labour government to bring in a capital gains tax to complete the suite of simple, broad-based, low-rate taxes didn't go through. That opened up this hole, and the way that our society has developed since really the early 2000s, when the banks started leaning heavily, is that we've created this very divided society, an economy that is a housing market with bits tacked on, where there is one group of people who are now vastly separated from tenants because they are genuinely really, really rich. And perpetuating that situation, protecting that wealth, is what really matters. And there's the whole them and us thing. But we've got this now incredibly big division between homeowners and renters. And because in middle class New Zealand is that you don't want to be a renter, you've failed as a person or a family if you're still a renter, and if you can't even get a property in a state house, then that's the lowest of the low, which that's just wrong.
The people, we meet lots and lots of people in state houses. They don't think public housing. They don't think like that.
No. But if you're the editor of Northern Advocate or the Rotorua Daily Post, you've got to remember too that in the last 20 to 30 years, the share of revenue coming from the real estate industry and banks and insurers and all of the apparatus around the family home value now makes up, I reckon, more than 60% of the, not just the revenues, but basically the profits that newspapers still make. And it wasn't that high back before the 2000s. And that's because of all sorts of reasons. Small businesses don't advertise in newspapers anymore. Even supermarkets don't advertise in newspapers much anymore. So that means if you're a newspaper editor, your interests, and remember they're the ones still doing most of the reporting in New Zealand, not radio or television. In most of New Zealand, it's still basically it's the newspaper. They need to appeal to real estate agents, homeowners, and the idea of ever-rising land values and equity to continue to sell their papers. Because, sadly, most of the people who buy the papers are homeowners. And the young people who might have a different view, they're not even buying the paper or reading it. So, but if you're in the political system and you're looking at what is the public sentiment on a thing, the only thing you can really judge it by is what you read in the paper. So, the views or the judgments of, the other Bernard suddenly become quite important if you're a politician. Sorry. Or
All right. I grew up in State House in Panmure, and it was a working class community. It wasn't a place where and everyone had a job, and you didn't qualify for a state house by essentially being unemployed, poverty-stricken, or a refugee. I think people can hear me. And I think we need to get back to that situation. so long as people who are in state houses are seen as getting something they are getting that I can't get, and meanwhile I live in poverty, in paying rack rents, in the private landlord system, then we're never going to convince people that public housing is a good thing. I don't think. I think the problem we have had is that I think we need to target 20-30% of housing needs to be public housing, and we get rid of the private rental market. The tremendous and heroic efforts you made to increase public housing increased it by 2%.
Question?
3, yes. Is it a reasonable or meaningful goal to have public housing as of right?
I was 3.8 is that we've got some of the lowest amount of public housing in the world, and we actually had our eyes on accommodation supplement. Why are we supplementing private landlords? Why didn't we build more houses? And that was tried, but it was hard to get across. And actually the Treasury has done work on who gets the benefits from accommodation supplement. And I don't think it's the tenants.
Can I channel a median voter who decides elections back at you? So the median voter who decides elections is a homeowner living in the suburbs who doesn't really care about their jobs. That's not the reason they exist. The reason they exist is to own residential land, to gear it up and to make tax-free capital gains on that residential land, and to get really rich tax-free of that land. And anything that threatens that model, and we start with the capital gains tax, and then we go on to higher government debt, which increases mortgage rates very slightly, and even worse, higher government debt used to create housing supply which competes with my rentals is a threat. And so if I am one of those swinging median voters in the suburbs, and the politicians, both Labour and National, know they need to win my vote, they will appeal to my conservative approach to retaining that wealth, retaining that business model, and destroying any threats to it. And I actually don't think we solve the underlying problem here, which is growing inequality and a them and an us problem, and the political economy drive our housing market with bits tacked on, until you start taxing the wealth or the capital gains in residential land, and not just for rental properties, but for home-owned properties.
Simon Wilson and Tricia Reid, and that's the end of it. Simon.
A couple of things I wanted to ask about, one from Bert, one from Philippa. Just in relation to the Herald and newspaper. Bear with me.
Okay.
We now know every day, in fact every minute of every day, how many people are reading every story on our website, and how many people are subscribing to the newspaper by clicking on one of those stories and going to the subscription page because it's behind the paywall and they want to read the whole thing. We know all those numbers. Those numbers drive what the Herald does. It's not that we, as an organisation, have sat down and said, cycleways are terrible, or Kāinga Ora is terrible. That's not the process. The process is that story about why cycleways are terrible did well. That story about Kāinga Ora tenants did well. And that's why you see so many of them.
Which is an abandonment of editorial judgment.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But it does mean that if you believe in media and you do get information from media and you'd like to get some information from the Herald, for heaven's sake, if you're doing it online, click on the stories that are good, click on the stories that are worth reading, and if you want to subscribe, do it through a story that you like, because the writer of that story will get paid for another week.
Simon, no one can hear you online.
Yeah. I'm the journalist. To Simon. Simon's brilliant and is single-handedly doing fantastic work at the Herald, and I always click on your stories, Simon. Extremely happy subscriber to the New Zealand Herald. I never click on the stories written by Bernards. No, that's not quite. Have to, but you make a good point, which is the people who have the money to subscribe and the people who the advertisers want to reach are the ones who own the properties, and it's in their interests not to allow state houses. Now, when Michael Joseph Savage and Peter Fraser and others were dreaming this up, they were appealing to an audience who were more equitable, and there was a political business model for weaponised equity in residential land. House prices were 1 or 2 times income if you could buy them. Now they're 9 times income, and I think you can't really change the dynamic much when you've got these wide gaps between the very rich and the very poor, and when the fundamental driver of our entire economy and our political economy is $2.1 trillion in equity in New Zealand residential land.
I did want to ask a question about
Sorry.
something slightly different, which was because I agree with everything you said, Bernard. I've been to quite a lot of Kāinga Ora meetings in communities where they're building a development and the community has come along to register their opposition and sometimes support. It's not just property values that people who are opposed to them talk about. A much more common theme is these people will endanger our community. They are going to be dangerous people. And I've seen Kāinga Ora, I've seen a Kāinga Ora staffer lose it once and say, you know, you all do realise that in ordinary households that are not Kāinga Ora homes, just ordinary households in the country, there are a lot of dangerous people. Did not go down well, but of course it's true.
Shall we do for the...
My question is, there's a challenge for the organisation there, it seems to me, and I wonder what your response is, Philippa. What does Kāinga Ora have to do to help people understand not only that people on the register need proper housing, decent housing, not only that actually that's the thing that will help them more than anything else, but that they are ordinary New Zealanders and it helps society where we are integrated and live amongst each other.
This was Simon Will online saying that he'd been to lots of meetings where both pro and con, but mainly people who objected to the type of people who they perceived were going to come to Kāinga Ora houses. That the second to last slide I showed about the Rolleston, we just had a master's student in her master's on asking people all around the area there. It's in Mount Cook, what they thought about the building of the housing and how they were finding it now, and they were all very positive. And that, of course, it's a huge having all those meetings with the communities and people who are very vocal, and it became last election very, very political. So I imagine if you asked the people who thought that they were scumbags that were going to be living there, they'd be voting a certain way, and others were kind of more tolerant and interested. I think a lot of people might go to private schools or something. They don't have much contact range of unions, or the kids don't do holiday jobs on the roads, or get his fingers squashed in a printing works that my brother so there was a mixture and holiday jobs and things like that. But I do think we're going to continue looking at property values, so maybe that would be a way to persuade people that actually well-built Kāinga Ora or community housing adds to the value of their community and the kind of richness of those communities.
I would happily write the story from that research to go onto the front page of the New Zealand Herald. I will give it to the Herald, in which I a little data tool so that every person in every neighbourhood who owns a home can put their own address into the homes.co.nz/Kāinga Ora. Fantastic. Put my address in and push a button that says with Kāinga Ora houses next to it, without Kāinga Ora houses next to it. You will, with the Kāinga Ora houses next to it, you'll be $400,000 richer. Without, 400,000 poorer. But more importantly, I would put another button that says, with the Kāinga Ora houses next to it, the number of kids going to A&E with chest infections every year drops 14%, and the amount of money we spend on hospital nights is down 53%, and your mother, when she does break her hip, will find a room in the hospital where previously it wouldn't be. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. It's a really nice finishing note. But actually, and those kind of things would have been done in Britain about persuading people to do the census and various things. This is what you can find out from your neighbourhood. And of course there's all that, what's the thing that you can look at house prices in your neighbourhood. Homes.co. Yeah, I'm happy to help with that.
Yeah.
Happy to get all our
just push a button.
Yeah.